This is AJ Wachtel. Welcome to my podcast, Wachtelligence, where I discuss with my guests the past, present, and future of the local and national music scene with a focus on Boston and New England. Today's episode, AJ Wachtel, still alive and well, is about the legendary life and career of me, a longtime entertainment journalist whose work has appeared in print and online for 4 decades. I have played in Boston bands Boney Maroney, Blind Lemon Pledge and the Sing Eye Dogs, and an Allman Brothers cover band called the Alston Brothers. I've helped run a famous and infamous nightclub, Bunrattys, during the area's last great music era. I was the A&R, artist and repertoire guy, for first Fast Track Records and then Boattown Records, and put out 4 compilation albums. During one period as an entertainment journalist, I had the cover stories simultaneously in the East Coast Boston Blues Society newsletter, Blues Blast magazine in the Midwest, and Bluesy News in Sacramento on the left coast. I've also written entertainment gossip columns for The Beat, Insignificant, Rita and Lolita for The Noise, when The Noise was New England's longest-running entertainment publication, and Wachtelligence for The Improper Bostonian, and cover stories and reviews for many other local and national publications. I came to Boston to attend Boston University from New Jersey around the start of the punk rock era in 1974. And soon moved a block away from the Rat in Kenmore Square. After getting thrown out of Miles Standish Hall my senior year of undergraduate studies for smoking weed, I moved to Allston and began my MBA studies and got in with the Bunrattys crowd and met Mickey O and Dave G, who ran the bar and also had started the Beat magazine across the street, the best entertainment around town. And soon I was writing many, if not most, of their cover stories, along with Insignifica and some live reviews. For the past 40 years, my articles, reviews, and columns have appeared in the Beat magazine, the Noise magazine, the Phoenix, the Herald, and the Globe, Boston Rock, the Boston Blues Society newsletter, the Improper Bostonian, the Music Museum of New England, and a dozen other long-ago local fanzines and publications. For a long period of time, I saw more live bands than any other person in the area go to 2, 3, and 4 nightclubs a night to collect news from my gossip column and to collect their new CD and album releases to listen to and help spread their word. For more than a decade, I didn't spend a dime for any alcohol. I consumed everything. The Middle East in Cambridge still doesn't charge me. That might be a record. On today's slightly different episode, we're turning the tables and we're having David Schwartz, my producer and old friend, be AJ Wachtel, the host. David?
Thanks, AJ. It's an honor to do this. It's been an honor to kind of be part of this podcast. You know, when we put this podcast together, the goal was to kind of archive the historical aspects of the Boston music scene. And the more that we talk to other musicians, the more we realize you've got a great story to tell. So I'm happy that we're able to utilize this episode to tell your story. You grew up in New Jersey, and then you came to Boston in 1974 to go to Boston University. Were you studying journalism at that time?
No, my first semester I was studying medicine. I had just gotten into a bad car accident, and so everything was going as pre-planned. I was accepted to Boston University for pre-med, so that's what I started out. But you know, I almost killed myself. You know, I got into a very bad car accident. I just couldn't deal with the competition. So I switched to learn how to read and write. And I switched to English. And I started studying Chaucer, Shakespeare.
It wasn't until the early 80s that you started working for Beat Magazine. Can you tell us how you ended up at Beat Magazine?
Right. When I moved to Allston, I drank at the sister bar of Fathers 2, Fathers 3 or Fathers 4, whatever it was, Fathers 5. And I met a bunch of the guys, the bartenders from Bunrattys, which was right down the street, a block away, on an off night, and they were guzzling beers. So, of course, I caught up with them and hooked up with them. We were guzzling beers. They brought me back to Bunrattys, and I never left. That's how I got into Bunrattys.
So how do you go from Bunrattys to writing for the beat?
Well, when I started going to Bunrattys and drinking and hearing the live music, I got to be friends with Mickey O'Halloran and David G, who were the manager and assistant manager at Bunrattys at the time. And they had started the Beat magazine, which was located right across the street from Bunrattys, and the best entertainment around town. And little by little, they got me into writing, and I never left.
And the first article was Bruce Marshall?
And the Clue, yes. And he's still playing up in the North Shore in Vermont and Maine. All these years later, almost 40 years later, he's still real popular.
Did you have a passion for writing, or was it something they forced you to do?
That's just something I started doing. My first thing that I ever wrote was in the 5th grade when C.B. Colby, a children's author, was coming to my grammar school, and me and my friend, my co-schoolmate, wrote a story that was published in the Springfield Leader, 1967, and that was my first taste of journalism. And then in high school, I started writing for the Dayton Journal, covering music. I wrote about the Beatles, Johnny Winter, the Allman Brothers. And then after that, I went to college, and then I met Mickey O'Halloran throughout, my journeys a couple of years later, and started writing for the Beat magazine.
Were there any writers or journalists that you admired?
No, I mean, I read everything: Steve Morse, Jim Sullivan, Clea Simon, Ted Drzdowski. These were very important people, in my life to let me know what was going on.
How would you describe your writing style?
Oh, that's easy. I write just like I talk, loud and opinionated.
In your experience, what was the difference between the Boston and the New York music scenes?
Well, there is big differences, but you got to remember, at the time, the first punk rock invasion, that Jimmy Harold from the Rat was sending bands back down to New York City, Boston bands, to Hilly Crystal's CBGBs, and Hilly was sending New York City bands back up to Boston. Every September, people from all over the world bring their music, their instruments, their talents to Boston and get into bands and play. Pre-internet, bands had to be signed to major label who would distribute their records and then be put on a major tour with a major act. And, what's important about that fact back then was that Peter Wolf and the Jay Giles Band, they were a noted exception. They had the Stompers, John Butcher. They had people like that as their opening bands. And the Jay Giles Band is just off the heels of touring with the Rolling Stones in the 70s. So this is a major deal that really put a lot of eyes on the Boston music scene. And so, New York City was a lot more competitive. You had to play, you could play in Boston, you could play at gigs in town, many clubs. You could play your own music. But New York City was more of a cover gig place. If you played Queen, if you were a Heart cover band, if you were a Clash cover band, you got gigs, and you might be able to sneak a song or two of your own in. But it was a different scene here than it was back then, and I'm sure I don't know, after the pandemic that changed everything worldwide with the music industry. But there was a lot of difference, and like in Boston, many musicians often played in multiple bands, sometimes on the same bills. Sometimes you had the Dogmatics in three bands, three in the members of the Dogmatics playing on the same gig, with different bands. It was wild. And you know what? In Boston, if you were on one of those bands and you needed a new drum head, or you needed new strings, or you needed this, or you needed that, you could ask somebody in the band that was opening for you or on the same bill. In Boston, it was a lot easier and a lot more friendlier and a lot more family-like. In New York City, they sneer at you, and curse you out. That was, I'm sure that I'm speaking a lot more generally than it was, but that was what I found in my experience.
What I find intriguing is from Beat Magazine, you actually had a front row seat to some of the greatest musicians ever. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of mention a few people that you've actually had encounters with. So I'm going to list a few people, and let's get some of your stories, which is, what I'm excited to do this podcast of. And I think if we're talking rock and roll, there's really one person that it starts with, and that's Mr. Chuck Berry.
Tommy Hambridge played drums for Chuck Berry, and he was playing up in Lowell. And I went up to Lowell and the Lowell Auditorium, and that's an old place. And I was there for sound check, and I met Chuck Berry, and I shook his hand, and his fingers were up half my arm. He had long fingers. He was playing piano for the sound check too, not guitar. And then I asked him, I said, Mr. Berry, made sure I called him Mr. Berry, showed my respect. I said, can I have a picture taken with you? And he said, maybe later. And of course, maybe later never came.
That's great. How about Jerry Lee Lewis?
Jerry Lee Lewis, he was a character. He came to play a rare show at Boston at the Channel. And I'm standing about 1.5 feet away from him. And I said, Jerry, welcome to Boston. I'm AJ Wachtel from the Beat Magazine. I'm standing 1 foot away from him, and he's got his young female attendant, whatever she was, standing there. So it's us three standing off stage. So I said, I asked him, I said, Jerry, I asked him a question. And then Jerry turns to he looks at me, and he turns to his assistant and answers her, and she turns her head to me and says exactly what he said 6 inches away from me to me. And I'm stoned and I'm drunk, and I'm saying, oh man, this killer, he is a wild one. And by the way, I did see men in suits waiting for him to get paid and take his money after the gig.
That's fantastic. That kind of reminds me of a James Brown story that you told me once.
James Brown, he played the Channel also. Rare gig. And I go there, and I go right off to there's a separate section right off to the stage where people can sit and watch. And I walk there, there's about 20 people there, and I see Steve Tyler from Aerosmith there. And I go, hey, Steve. And he goes, hey, Jay. And we sit there and hang out together, and he goes, oh, do you know my friend Joey Kramer? So he introduced me to Joey Kramer, the drummer from Aerosmith. And I've got to see Joey a couple times over the years and reminded him of that story, and he always cracks up and gives me a hug and laughs. But at any rate, so there we were watching James Brown. And, the funny thing about James Brown was everybody, I was there for, before the setup and everything, all of his roadies were in tuxedos, and they all had diamonds. They were setting up his equipment on stage all in tuxedos. Everybody, his sister was there in charge of the merchandise. Everybody called him Mr. Brown. It was wild. I mean, even his sister, everybody. And it was just so weird seeing men in tuxedos setting up amplifiers on a stage. And he gave a kick-ass show, too. It was great.
James Brown at the channel. I mean, how legendary is that? So in true Wachtelligent fashion, we reached out to a few people for some quotes. So let me read to you what John Butcher said. John Butcher, the legendary John Butcher Axis. As a contributing writer for Beat Magazine, AJ documented the Boston music scene in personal and a relatable way that spoke to people. His reporting was sharp and pivotal, not only for local fans, but for those of us who went on, got record deals, and toured nationally. During this time, AJ and I became friends and pals. We shared a love of music and for the city that made it possible for us to do what we do. I owe him a huge debt of gratitude.
That's great. John is a friend, a friend for life. Well, first of all, you didn't mention his first band, Johanna Wild. They were a great band live. The first time I ever saw him was at Uncle Sam's down in Hull. And many moons ago, he was opening up for Johnny Winter. And of course, I was backstage with Johnny Winter and the crew. And I saw him, and I was turned on. He was a three-piece John Butcher Axis. Boy, was he good. And so then a day or two later, I'm walking out of my house in Alston on Harvard Ave, and I see John Butcher walking alone. So I ran up to him and said, "Hey, John," I said, "I saw you. I was, backstage, and I waved to him, blah blah blah." And he gave me a hug, and that's many moons ago, and we've been good buddies ever since. Good for you, John. Keep rocking.
And as we talk about the Boston scene, the legendary bands that came out of here, let's start with Aerosmith.
Alicia Jared Perry, Joe Perry's first wife, used to bring their oldest son, Anthony Joseph Perry, in a stroller to sound checks and tell his son to give the other AJ a high five. And we'd always crack up, and he always did. And I like Steven. Steven's just a great guy. I ran into him at a Christmas party they had when they ran Mamakin, when they owned the club Mamakin. He had a special invite for a special Christmas party, and I asked him to take a photo with me, and he leaned back heavily against my check, like we were family. He's just the nicest guy in the world. Another cool show that happened there at Mamakin was when the first guitarist, Ray Tabano, played there. They just owned Mamakin, so they had him play there. And Steve and Joe went on stage and they played 4 or 5 songs. Can you imagine that? If that happened in New York City, that would be on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. But it's just a memory here in Boston. A great one, however. I'll never forget that.
Let's talk about the Jay Giles Band.
When you talk about Peter Wolf, I think about first my 2 decades apart articles with him in the Beat magazine after his second solo album, Come As You Are, came out. And then for the Noise magazine, at the time, it was New England's longest running entertainment publication. He was so appreciative of my first story about him when he was trying to get a name for himself outside of Jay Giles, outside of Boston. He sat me in a special front row seat when he was recording for his MTV video, Can't Get Started. You can see me at the end. He comes up and he gives me a high five. It was open bar the whole time, and they just kept going song after song after song. It was just so cool. It was at Spit right across on Lansdowne Street. That was in front of maybe 150 people. And another great story I have is when I first became diabetic, we were drinking at the Rat. we were drinking Heinekens. They kept giving us Heinekens. And he kept, after a while, he kept putting the beer that the bartender put in front of me, he just slammed it away from me. We were getting hammered. And he put it away, and I just said, and I put it back, and I slammed it back. So he did it again. And then I slammed it back. He goes, all right, fuck you. Go kill yourself. Do what you want. You have diabetes. You shouldn't be drinking. And I realized right then that Wolf was being Wolf. And it was a really touching moment that he really cared. And I just shut my mouth, and I didn't say a word. Bar hopping with him was always fun. I remember once we were behind the Middle East, and we were sitting back in the Middle East in the staircase where they loaded in. And there was Peter Wolf, there was me, there was Bobby Bear, the drummer, the legendary Bobby Bear, late Bobby Bear, and Willie Alexander. So we're behind the Middle East, and they take a photo, and they're talking and everything. And, and by the way, Bobby Bear, the late Bobby Bear, grew up as a friend, and he was a correspondent to the Three Stooges. He had the greatest Three Stooges collection of anyone. He used to have letters. He showed me stuff. I wonder where it is now, but Bobby Bear, the legendary punk drummer in Boston, was also a good friend of Mo Howard from the Three Stooges. But at any rate, so there they are. There's a photo somewhere of all of them sitting together, and you can see my pant legs in the back, just from my waist down. So then me and Wolf, we went to TT the Bears to hold court, and I'll tell you, it's always a blast going anywhere with Wolf. Peter Wolf went to art school, in the museum art school. And he actually drew a portrait of me. James Montgomery did, also an art student in college. So I have two portraits of moi from Peter Wolf and James Montgomery hanging on my walls right now. I don't know anybody else that can claim that factoid. Funny story about Seth Justman. He taught piano lessons to Red Sox shortstop legend Rico Petrocelli. And I'm friends with Rico because my next door neighbor in Springfield, New Jersey, growing up, Mr. Bernie Kirschenbaum, was Rico's gym teacher in New York when Rico was in high school. So I know Rico since I was a little kid. And so I'm still in touch with Rico. And Rico had a benefit, or he had an event down in Faneuil Hall. And I show up there, and I just want to say hi to Rico because our paths didn't cross much anymore. And there says Justman. And I have a photo somewhere of me, Rico Petrocelli, and Seth Justman. What an odd trio that is, huh? So, and Danny Klein. Let's talk about Danny Klein. DK and I are very old friends. One of my favorite DK stories is about 20 years ago. We were in Marshfield. There was a Danny Klein Full House show. That's his solo band that just does, that current band that just does Jay Giles covers. And he doesn't see me. I see his back. And I'm a little bit stoned, a little bit drunk. Sound check, beautiful day out. And there's a couple of girls, groupies. They're all gushing around him. And so she's going to me, I'm talking to her because she's a cute blonde. She goes, it's my birthday today. Do you think DK will autograph my blah, blah, blah? So I tell her, yeah, go up to him. Go up to him and ask him. So she goes up to him, and I can say, I say out loud, hey, it's his. I say it's her birthday, and I said, why don't you ask DK to give you a birthday kiss? And he knows he recognizes my voice. I can see his shoulders scrunch up. So what he does was he turns around, faces me, and he bends the woman over and he gives her a very theatrical kiss. And I'll tell you, I am sure that she is still, telling that story today, 30 years later, how she was kissed on her birthday by Danny Klein from the Jay Giles band. Whenever I go see him now in his current band, he plays with Rosie Rosenblatt, who's a legendary blues harp player. Mr. Viztone, he owns Viztone Records, which is a major blues label. And whenever we hang out together, it's like three old Jews sitting there trying to insult each other. And it's just like, I'll tell you, it's really hard for me to even keep up with those two guys. They're older than me and they have years of practice. And I'll tell you, I have a big catalog of events and stuff I've said that can be made fun of. So, I just take it and I just sit there and try to hold my own and insult the hell out of them while they're nonstop insulting me. But I love every minute of it.
That's great. One more Boston band I want to speak about are the Cars. I know you had a personal relationship with Benjamin Orr for one, but why don't you tell us your recollections of the Cars?
I was pretty close with Ben Orr for a while. In fact, his son, Ben Orr Jr., and my son, Harrison, I have a photo somewhere of behind the hat shell on the grass, Ben and Harrison, two real blonde-haired kids playing together, sitting on the grass playing together, while me and Ben were watching over them, the two fathers, just keeping an eye on them. And I remember thinking about how cool it was, of that fact. So I once show up at the South Station. He had a South Station gig there, the Ben Orr Band, with John Kalishis playing guitar and Muzz on drums from Fahrenheit on drums. And John Kalishis is the guy who was the producer and the main guy behind all those Rat albums, Live at the Rat albums that came out. And I was South Station having a concert there. They haven't done that in years, and that was great. But there they were, bringing me downstairs under South Station, and all there are tunnels. They're tunnels and rats. And we were thinking about debating whether to go down and see where these unlit tunnels went to. They had tracks in them. Who knows where they went? But it was unsafe, and those rats were as big as raccoons. But there I was with Ben Orr, as he was showing me underneath the South Station. It was great. And another member of the Cars I'm pretty close to is Elliot Easton. This guy is just a legend. I once went. He was playing at a benefit on the Cape, and the people that are promoting it, they didn't know what he looked like, so they knew I was friends. So they asked me if they could pick him and Jill, his wife, up at Logan Airport at midnight, and I said sure. I was a little bit stoned, a little bit buzzed. I said sure. So I went up to Elliot, and I said, "Hey, Elliot." And he said, "Hey, AJ," and he got his guitars, and we got into the car with Jill. And he met his wife, Jill, many, many moons ago. She was a waitress at the Rat.
A quote we have from a Boston musician we have is Jerry Lahane, leader of the Dogmatics. And his quote is, "I would have to say on behalf of the Dogmatics that AJ was such a huge supporter of the local rock scene, and he was everywhere all at once. He always championed us, even though we were a pretty low-level band to some of the huge rock star bands that he also wrote about. I do remember one night at Father's 2 on Beacon Street, right near Fenway, AJ came into a packed bar, and he was larger than life, and he always made an entrance with a unique voice. Father's 2 was primarily a punk bar, where all the punk rock bands hung out. It wasn't like Bunrattys, which was mainly heavy metal, but AJ, with his long hair and almost hippie appearance, could seamlessly move through different genres. This particular night, he spotted me, Peter, and Paul of the Dogmatics. He came over, gave us a big hug, and then challenged us to a chug contest. I got to tell you, I've never seen anyone finish a pint of beer faster than AJ. It was quite a feat going against us, but he beat us fair and square, and this will go on for some time. I only wish AJ the best, and he's always been a good friend to the Dogmatics.
I'll tell you, I used to love the Dogmatics. Thinking back, you got to remember, 1980s, Flynn was the mayor, Menino was the mayor. This wasn't, the Mayor Wu era of today. This was a very hardcore, Boston town. But, you followed the rules or they came down hard on you. And I remember they always had parties after hours, after the bars closed. Everybody would go back to to the Dogmatics house in the South End. They had parties, kegs there. It was wild. I remember seeing, and then they had people playing music, playing bands. I mean, the legends of the punk era would be there partying till the sun came up. That couldn't happen today, but it was just a great story. And I don't think I ever paid for a beer there either.
Let's talk about some of the locations, some of the venues that have come and gone. You did speak earlier about Bunrattys. What can you tell us about Bunrattys?
All right, Bunrattys was pretty much, it had a few evolutions. When Dennis Mullins originally owned it, it was a real mainstream rock and roll place. Bands like The Drive, James Montgomery, Newman, Johnny A, Hearts on Fire, people like that would be playing there. The Beat magazine was located walking distance across the street, and me and Mickey O'Halloran would go to 2, 3, 4 nightclubs a night so that I could collect CDs to hear and help them spread the word, to get band news for my gossip columns. And I would always head back to Bunrattys for last call.
Any bands played there that went on to huge success?
You got to remember, James Montgomery originally was just a real local guy. Then he went to play with Johnny Winter after he played at Bunrattys for years. Face to Face, another good example. Stu Kimball played with Bob Dylan. Face to Face had a major local hit, a 10-9-8. And a funny story about Face to Face. Mickey O'Halloran was booking the band, and Laurie Sargent and the band were upstairs and looking, and they're complaining that Mickey O put 10-9-8 under the advertising in the Herald, or that's the way the logo, the ad print went. So they were complaining. You go, but we're a new band, Mickey. And Mickey, just without blinking an eye, goes, if you're a new band, how about I pay you $50, right? And nobody said a word. And she shut up and everybody shut up. Great Mickey O story. But, another band, Johnny A. Johnny A was in the Streets, in Hearts on Fire. And then he went out to play with the Yardbirds. That's huge. Or Till Tuesday, look at Amy Mann, Robert Holmes, or Cliff Goodwin. Cliff used to play with John Butcher Axis. Then he went on to play with Joe Cocker. There's a lot of people. I remember a few times when famous people came in to visit me too. There would always be, they'd come up and tell me, I'd be on the floor, and the doorman would say, AJ. So they one day they go, AJ, guy named Slash is here. So I go and I see a guy in a top hat, and I recognize him, a short guy. And I had met him once before, many moons ago. So we're talking for a few bits. I go, hey, you want to guzzle a beer? You want to get a drink? He goes, oh, no. I'm sober now. And I left. Then he went downstairs, and I don't know if he drank or not. Or I brought Joe Ely, the legendary rockabilly guy who just died. He played a gig at Night Stage, and I always went to see him play and visit with him because he was friends from Austin with Billy Cowsill, the oldest brother who owned a bar there. So I go back to Joe Ely, and I said, Joe, the gig was great. Why don't you come back with me to Bunrattys and play pool? Because we were talking about pool or something. I think he might have said, too bad there's no pool tables here. So I said, let's go back to Bunrattys. So I brought him back to Bunrattys. He went downstairs. Nobody knew who he was. And he played pool for another hour. He loved it. We smoked a joint in the car, too. And he goes, oh, no, it was a chillum, because I didn't have a joint. He goes, oh, I haven't smoked in a long time. I don't know if that was a lie or not, but I smoked with Joe Ely and took him to Bunrattys. Another great Bunrattys visitor was Lieutenant Billy Kennevick. I had met him through Mickey O'Halloran. He was an older guy, and he had a young blonde girl on his side when he came into Bunrattys. So Mickey O he brings me across the street to the Beat magazine with Billy and his girlfriend, and Mickey walks away from the table, and there's a gram of cocaine on there. And I go to Billy, I go, so where do you know Mickey from? Do you own a club? And he laughs, smirks, and he pulls out his badge from his wallet. And I'm thinking, Sonny Corleone, I'm going to get busted just like he got nailed in the toll booth. And I'm going, hum, and him and Mickey are crying with laughter at that. A couple of months later, he comes walking into Bunrattys, and he had been on patrol in his cities, and he comes walking in, and they go to me. They go, AJ, there's a cop in plain clothes looking for you. So I say, oh yeah? So I see Billy Kennevick there, and I say, what's up? He goes, AJ, I just pulled over a guy on Route 9 speeding, and he had pot on him, so I took this for you. And he pulls out a half ounce of weed in the kitchen station and just hands it to me in front of everybody. He was a fucking cop. He wasn't going to get busted, but that's the way it was back then. Shit like that don't happen today.
If I mention the Rathskeller to you, what immediately comes to mind?
Jimmy Harold. He changed everything.
Care to elaborate?
When I was a sophomore at BU, I moved in across the street, and the first band I saw there was a band called the Malls. And there was a guy, Bill Koff, on my floor from New York City who played electric bassoon. Electric bassoon? And they played, I mean, like real avant stuff. And I went to see him, and he was getting off the stage playing and jumping on the tables. I had never seen anything like that. And then I just started hanging out, and I became good friends with Mitch, who was a great jazz player, great horn player, but he couldn't speak. And he was just a great, great supporter of music. Tiny Tim's playing. The Swingin' E's are opening up. And I was good friends with Johnny Angel, who played in Blind Lemon Pledge and the Seeing Eye Dogs from time to time, and their drummer, Gary Cook. Gary Cook was the first drummer I ever saw that played standing up without a seat. Just picture that. There'd be the kick drum, there'd be snares and cymbals, and there he would be standing up behind you with the drumsticks, not sitting down. So I'd never seen that before. And they opened up, and the place was packed. The place was packed. You couldn't move. But I knew that if I wanted to meet, this guy or Tiny Tim, that I had to go near the dressing room door. And that's where I moved myself to. And I'll tell you, I'll never forget. I can still vividly picture right now him doing Tiptoe Through the Tulips on his ukulele in the Rathskeller. I can still picture him walking towards me and me sticking my hand out and shaking his hand and him grinning and oohing. and then disappearing into the dressing room with the swinging knees. Just a wild, wild show. That's another reason why Jimmy Harold was just great. He was, in contact with the guy from CBGB's. They'd have all the bands, the punk bands from CBGB's, come up and play here, and he would have all the bands that are popular up here play down at CBGB's. What a big thing in the big picture that was for the Boston music scene.
Quick quote from Chance Langton. AJ had a soulful connection with all the legendary rockers and more. AJ wonderfully sheds light upon their accomplishments with a dimension no other writer has ever had. Not only does he give you a fantastic overview, but you sense that he's part of the brotherhood.
Roy Buchanan introduced me to Chance. I was very close with Roy Buchanan for a long time. And he was at Jonathan Swift's in Harvard Square, and I see this guy walking with a guitar and a beret on. And Roy goes, "You know Chance Langton?" I said, "I've heard you. You're a famous comedian in town." And that had to be like 35 years ago. And from time to time, he would get on stage with Roy, the only player that Roy would let on stage to play with him in Boston. And it was just a pleasure. And I'm still good friends with Chance. Funny man, funny guy. One of the greatest times I had with Chance Langton was he took me around to bars. We were drinking. And we were in this car, and I was in his front seat, and I'm smoking, right? And smoking a chillum. And then he starts with talking to me like he's Jay Leno. And I had for a half hour Chance Langton speak to me like Jay Leno. And it was funny because we all know Jay, and Jay has certain idiosyncrasies, and they were very funny. And hearing his old friend making fun of him, to me, a foot away, is a memory I'll never forget. Didn't pay the rent, but it's a great story.
You very briefly brought up Roy Buchanan, who was an amazing guitarist. Any more stories regarding him?
Roy and I were very close for the last 6 or 7 years of his life. I met him, Tommy Hamridge, TH, when he was at Berkeley. I mentioned before, all the major artists that didn't have bands would call him up to get a band together when they were touring in Boston. Link Ray, Chuck Berry, Roy Buchanan. And first time I met him, we were backstage, and TH goes, "Guzzle a beer for him." So I guzzle a beer real quickly, and he looks me in the eye and he goes, "Just like Eddie Cochran used to do it." And I was silent. Eddie Cochran's the classic rock and roller who died young, who wrote 20 Flight Rock, Summertime Blues. And here he was, the guy who Rolling Stone magazine had just a few years earlier had given a cover story and said he was the most unknown, best guitarist in the country. And, he was just a great guy. And I was real impressed. Once we were in his tour bus. He toured in Boston for the last couple of years of his life, a couple of times a year. And he'd always come in town, and I'd always meet him and hang out with him. And we were sitting in his tour bus alone, catching up once before a gig. And we're smoking, doing lines and everything. And I go, how come between you and me, you really never joined the Rolling Stones in 1969 when Brian Jones died and Mick and Keith asked you? And he stopped everything and looked at me in the eye and goes, I said, in his Arkansas Southern drawl, he goes, "I just didn't think it would further my career none." And I remember that specifically saying career none, like he was from Arkansas, and he said that to me. And he always used to like me guzzling beers. And I remember one day Ronnie Earl, who was and still is one of the greatest blues guitarists on this planet, he's backstage with Roy, and me and Roy were just hanging out, guzzling, catching up, and Ronnie's sitting there and he's going, "Hey Roy, how do you do this? Blah 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 blah." And Roy didn't want to talk about that. He didn't want to talk about guitar. He just looks at me and he goes, "Hey Ronnie, you ever see AJ guzzle a beer?" And I was silent, but I was laughing inside. And then he just nods to me, so I guzzle a beer real quickly. And Ronnie, of course, had seen me do this a number of times, but he got the message. Roy didn't want to talk any, guitar or anything like that. He just wanted to hang out. And once Roy and I were backstage, he goes, in his tour bus, he goes, "You know why I like you, AJ, out of the Clear Blue?" He says this. He goes, "It's not because you're a great rider, but because you're a great guy." And that's something I'll always remember, about him. Another great thing is I asked him if Jimmy's version of "Hey Joe" was influenced by his version. And he of course, being the humble Arkansas guy, he wasn't bragging verbally and nonstop or anything, but he just gave me a nod and a smile, and that makes total sense. And whenever I listen to, and I saw Roy play that live a lot of times, and I would always hear Jimmy, and I knew it wasn't Roy copying Jimmy; it was Jimmy copying Roy, and that was just so impressed. When Roy died, it was sad. Tommy Hammers called me up at Bunrattys. I was walking upstairs, and Mickey O was sitting behind the desk. He goes, "Roy Buchanan just died. Tommy just called you." And then he turns around, and I can picture this in my mind right now, and dials TH's number. And Tommy tells me that Roy went after a gig. He lives in Virginia, West Virginia or something. And after a gig, he brought a friend home, and his wife, and this had happened a lot of times before, his wife was sick of it. He had a lot of guitars there. She didn't know this guy or anything. So she called up the cops, and the guy left. The cops came, the guy leaves, and Roy leaves too. He's all pissed off, and they pick him up for PC. And apparently, Roy, they looked in on him the next morning in the jail cell, and he had hung himself. Now, I knew Roy pretty well for the last couple of years of his life, and I'll tell you, Roy couldn't do 4 or 5 things at the same time when he was high and drunk like that. And I just strongly doubt that. I remember once he was standing on stage. He didn't move, he just, his eyes closed, his guitar, his Telecaster, just wailing. And I said to him afterwards, I said, "Roy," I said, "it's just so amazing. You don't move. You just stand in one spot and your guitar wails." And he just looks at me and smirks, and he taps his right index finger to his temple and goes, "You should see what's going on in here, AJ." And I just sat there and kept quiet and smirked. But his body was in the morgue for well over a year. And I had a friend that told me all of this. He didn't have a headstone, didn't have anything, didn't have a grave. And then finally, after a couple of years, she sold all of his guitars, and he was finally buried. And as far as I know, he sent me a picture of the gravestone. This is a couple of decades ago, but just a real sad, he deserved a lot better.
After Beat Magazine, you kind of shifted over to the blues. And again, you got to get a firsthand approach to some of the greatest blues players. Let's start with B.B. King.
B.B. King played up in New Hampshire, and the Wrecking Crew, a band that played every Sunday at Bunrattys, opened up for him. So I went up there, and I'm backstage with him, talking to him, just me and him sitting alone. And he had people in his family playing with him too. And it was a busy, it was a busy dressing room. But he was spent a half hour just sitting there talking to me in chairs, just sitting next to each other. Then a friend of mine comes by with a camera, and I go, BB, can I please get my picture taken with you? And he goes, put your arms around me, AJ. And I did. And I have a photo of that somewhere, too.
How about Buddy Guy?
Buddy Guy, I know from Tommy Hambridge. And I only met him once. And he was I only spoke to him. I met him backstage. There was only 2 or 3 people backstage, so I had a chance to talk to him. And he's just a lovely guy. A person in a legendary blues player that I was much closer to was James Cotton. James Cotton, for a long, long time, has been known as one of the greatest blues harpists at the time. It was the greatest blues harpist alive. Once he was playing at Night Stage, and I came up early, to hang out with him, and we were sitting out front of the nightclub. There was a tree with a bench around it, around the trunk, and we were sitting there smoking chillums and people watching and talking. And nobody knew that the greatest harp player alive was sitting there in front of them. They just kept walking by and everything. And me and me and him just really, really dug that.
Someone I know you had a personal relationship was with Edgar and Johnny Winter. I've got a quote here from Scott Spray, who had the honor of playing bass with both of those guys. And I want to read to you what he said. He says, I always loved AJ's interviews because he always seemed to ask the right questions that no one else ever thought of. We hung out with him a few times backstage and on our bus with Johnny, and Johnny always liked having him around because he was funny, respectful, and always had some great road stories to share.
When I think about Edgar Winter, a lot of people ask me the differences between him and Johnny, which is an obvious question. Johnny could take flash bulbs when photos were taken with him, but Edgar Winter couldn't. And that was the first thing he'd always tell you is no flashes. And also, Johnny was much more louder and opinionated. Edgar to me, was always just a lot nicer of a guy, And I'll tell you a funny Edgar Winter story is he played once at the Rat, and Jimmy Harold knew that I was close with the Winter brothers. So on the rider, the band rider, it says AJ will announce the drawing and the bands, but he is only to get 6 draft beers. Now I laughed about that, and how many people out there that aren't in the band are actually put on the band rider for beer drinking? And of course, all the bartenders there gave me drinks galore, so I drank like normal. Nobody listened to him. I have a great Johnny Winter story. I know him forever, and I was talking to him once backstage about how I had just got to see the Allman Brothers, and I was backstage, and there was no alcohol, no open bar. And that was the first time I'd ever been backstage to an Allman Brothers gig with no open bar. And I said, he just had a liver operation. He got a new liver. And I said, he's probably drinking less. So Johnny goes to me, he got a new liver. He's probably drinking more. And I laughed. And I'm saying, here I am with Johnny Winter as he's making fun of Greg Allman's sobriety. I said, that's pretty cool. I once went to see Johnny. They always called me up and let me know they were coming to town. And I went before the show, and they just pulled in late. They said, why don't you come in after? So after the show was over, I went in there, and there's Johnny sitting naked in the tour bus. and I say, and I mean naked. I mean, he was bare naked. And I realized that I must be an insider if they're letting me in. And he's sitting there, we're talking and everything. And it's like nothing's abnormal. And I'm sitting there saying, I'm sitting here with Johnny Winter naked in his freaking tour bus. That's just so bizarre. And another great Johnny Winter story is about you always see he played at Woodstock. Two great Johnny Winter stories. He played at Woodstock, and you always see photos of him at night. It was his threesome is playing wall blues, and he has a 12-string, a Fender 12-string, but he only has 6 strings on it. So I asked him that once, and he laughed. It's not like something that probably has come up too often in his interviews. So he goes, I just love the sound and the feel of the guitar, but I couldn't afford in 1969 to keep changing 12 strings every time I broke a string. So I couldn't afford the strings, so I only used 6 strings on the 12-string guitar. So if you ever see a photo of Johnny Winter playing Woodstock with 6 strings on his guitar, that's why. And, another story I asked him was, the Rolling Stones have a long time bootleg. The first time they ever played with Mick Taylor was at July 4th at a Hyde Park concert. And that's been a long time been a bootleg. And they do one of Johnny Winter's songs, I'm Yours and I'm Hers, from his first Columbia album, but they've misprinted it for 40 years. I'm yours, she's mine. That's what it says on the Rolling Stones bootleg, and it doesn't give Johnny any credit for the writing. And he just smirked when I asked him that. The last time I saw Johnny, he had a lot of things going for him. He was going on tour in Europe. He had just had a new album out with like Joe Perry and Billy Gibbons guesting on it. And he had a new hot pepper sauce out, which, folks, it wasn't as hot as I expected from a guy from Texas. But at any rate, he had all the shit out going on. I said, Johnny, I won't talk to you now. Next time you come back and next time I see you, I'll interview you then. And of course, that never came. He died.
Is there anybody I haven't brought up that you want to mention?
Off the top of my head, there's a lot of interesting people that I met. I'll just give short memories. I talked about the Cowsills. I introduced Barry to his wife Debbie, who was a DJ on WCGY, the oldie station, and they got married on my birthday, which was the summer solstice. And I was told later on during the after the ceremony that everybody thought that I was Waddy Wachtel, the famous guitarist who was friends with the Cowsills, and I laughed about that. And Richard Cowsill, he came to my wedding, and he was the person that caught the bouquet that Tina, my wife, threw over her shoulders. It was funny. He was sitting out talking to somebody in the audience, and all of a sudden the bouquet came in his direction, and I'm looking at him, and he caught it. Right, and by the way, James Montgomery also played my wedding, and he came down. It was a Saturday night. He came down, didn't get paid a couple of grand for a gig, and all he did was charge me gas money. And how's that? I go, hey James, how much are you gonna charge me? He goes, hey, I have to come down, and he told me once, he goes, the funniest thing about your wedding was your mom calling you Johnny. And I laughed about that. The last time the Allman Brothers played in town, James Montgomery picked me up, and we went back to the show. And I sat backstage, right on stage, right behind Greg Allman and across from Butch Trucks. And James came up and played harp on Statesboro Blues. James was the first Northern act artist to be signed to the Allman Brothers label, Capricorn Records. That's why he's still friends with Greg. He was never really close with all the rest, but he came really, really, really close with Greg. And that is pretty cool. Or, another great thing about the Allman Brothers, who I really became friends with because of James. And Dickie Betts and I both got our tattoos from the same guy, Lyle Tuttle, very famous guy. Whenever I would run into Dickie, we would hug each other and talk tattoos. I would never talk music with Dickie Betts. And I used to tell that to some of my friends who were jealous again. You mean to tell me you hang out with Dickie Betts and don't ask him blah, 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 blah? I said, no, we talk about the tattoo artists we know in California and what's the news about them. And then we show off anything new we have. Dickie had a lot of tattoos. Another great person that I became very close to was Foghat Roger Earl. Roger Earl moved up to Boston, and his manager at the time was Marco Hildeman. And Marco was a crazy guy who used to be a racing car driver. And he had a lot of famous shows in town. He was a big, big guy, and he had Foghat. And Foghat, I was running Bunrattys one night. It was a weekday night. There might have been 20 people in there. And all of a sudden, Roger Earl comes walking in. And Roger and I were drinking buddies. And he goes, AJ, this is my band. We're rehearsing in a small space. Can we get up on stage and play a few songs to get the feel of the stage? And I'm laughing. I'm going, sure. Here I have Foghat playing a couple of songs at Bunrattys during a weekday night in front of 20 people. So they played like a half hour. Then they got off stage, and me and Roger started drinking. That was a really funny story. Or another famous guy that I was quite close to was Noel Redding, and he was the bassist for Jimi Hendrix Experience. I'm not sure how I got to be friends with him. I probably just hustled my way backstage and got to be friends with him. But we were quite close for a long time. And I remember a couple of stories about him. After a gig, I took him to IHOP in Austin. Nobody knew who he was. And we just ate eggs and breakfast, and we're holding court with the guy who played with Jimi Hendrix. It was really cool. Or with Buddy Miles. Buddy Miles was a good friend of mine, and I probably hustled my way backstage to see him too. And Buddy was in the band The Gypsies. And I told him that Noel had once told me that Jimi Hendrix Experience never rehearsed. They never practiced, ever. And I told that story to Buddy Miles, and Buddy goes, Les, and he goes, no, Band of Gypsies, we rehearsed. And I thought that was a pretty funny, and getting back to Noel for a second, he once told me a story about Mitch Mitchell, the drummer. 20 years after Jimmy died, Mitch finds a guitar, a Stratocaster that he claimed was Jimmy's, and sold it for $250,000. This was a long time ago. And he was pissed off. And he's telling this to me. He goes, God damn it. He goes, that band, everything that we made was split third, 1/3. If we needed new strings, new equipment, everything came out of that money. She goes, the Hendrix estate and me should get 1/3 of that $250,000 each. And I said, and that was never resolved. And I go, so what do you think about Jimi Hendrix's father taking over the estate? And that's what happened back then, because the Hendrix family finally took over his estate to make sure that the posthumous albums were done correctly, and they made money and everything. And he laughed at me and he sneered. And he goes, "He's a fucking janitor." And I said, "Oh, that's pretty interesting." Funny, and the last thing I'll bring up about Noel was we were at Ed Burke's, and he was playing there, and the rumor was that Ginger Baker, who was playing a gig the next night in Worcester, was coming into town, and the place was packed. So I'm standing next to Ed Burke, mentioning that, and I look behind him, and I'm pretty drunk and I'm pretty stoned, and we're right near the bathrooms, which were on the stairway going downstairs, where you got beers and where the dressing rooms were. So I look past him and I see this tall, really ugly, really big man, and it was Ginger Baker. So I go, "Hey, Ed." I walk up to Ginger and I go, "Hey, Ginger, I'm AJ Wachtel. I'm a journalist, and this is Ed Burke, who owns this bar." So then I turned around and introduced Ed Burke to Ginger Baker. Then we went downstairs, and I pulled out my chillum, and me, Noel, and Ginger smoked a bunch of chillums of my weed, and I'm grinning. There's a guy there that I saw had a camera. I said, "Please take a picture of this." And I have a picture of me with Ginger and Noel, and I used to tell everybody that was my new band, and they'd all shake their head and grin. Another great person that I used to hang out with that I knew was Denny Lane from the Moody Blues. Now, I met him through his wild, wild wife, JoJo. And I ran into him in the late 80s at Johnny D's in Somerville, and we smoked. We had a great gig. Then I didn't see him again for like another 30 years. And I reminded him who I was, and I said, "JoJo introduced us." And I gave you a copy of Boston Does the Beatles because you were in Wings in Paul's band. And he laughed. He goes, "Oh, that was a long time ago." Funny story about JoJo Lane. Anybody in the scene remembers her. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful woman. I took Harrison's mother, Tina, to a booze cruise, and all of a sudden we're walking onto the boat. This is when I first knew Tina, and all of a sudden I hear AJ from the other side of the deck. And I see this short blonde girl. She runs across in front of everybody, pushing everybody away, and decks me. She like she's playing football. So there I am on the floor of the deck with this blonde-haired girl who just tackled me in front of Harrison's mother, who I was just dating. Another great memory is Papa John Creech from Jefferson Airplane, Hot Tuna. Him and I were good friends, and I brought Tina, Harrison's mother, speaking of Tina, to, I think it was in the Middle East in Cambridge, and he was downstairs. I remember his wife, Gretchen, and I had to teach him how to smoke a chillum, but he loved it. I put it in his hands, and he just loved learning how to smoke out of my chillum. Another great memory I have is of Kate Taylor from the Taylor family. When I brought Harrison down there to Martha's Vineyard, she met us at the Ritz, and we had lunch together. And I love Kate. Kate's a wonderful woman, and her brother Livingston. What an interesting guy! He's a pilot, but I've never flown with the guy. I mentioned I was just talking about Kate Taylor. I was quite close to her brother, Alex Taylor, who was in a band with James Montgomery, Buck and Bird Taylor, Skip Fisher, Larry Bader, the Funk Busters. And at his funeral, they all sang a cappella, "Will the Circle Be Unbroken?" And that was very touching. And a funny story about his funerals, there was a canoe filled with beer at his wake. And I always wondered if that was to sort of like acknowledge or give AT beer to go over the river Styx, like that ancient myth or anything like that. Somebody told me that that's why they had beer in a canoe. They asked all of the Taylor family if that was true or not, and they just shrug and they don't answer.
I'll tell you a great story about Alex Taylor. He lived in Martha's Vineyard, and I went to a July 4th party there once. Jimmy Buffett was there. And after I had a few chillums with Jimmy Buffett, he gave me his parrot earring. And I wore that parrot earring and told that story for many, many, many moons. Alex Taylor was just a great singer. I think everybody in the family think he was the most talented singer. Another person from the other famous family of folk rock from Boston, the Guthries, is Arlo Guthrie. I knew his wife well before she passed, and Arlo was just a funny off the wall type of guy. I once asked him, I said, what's the strangest place you were ever recognized? Because he's toured all over the world, and he's a famous guy. And he laughed at me, and he goes, most people I meet think I'm dead.
Donna Summer, the queen of disco. She was playing a gig, and of course I hustled my way backstage, and she was from Dorchester. So I went right back upstage, after her set, and I said, hey, Donna, I'm AJ Wachtel. I live in Dorchester, blah, blah, blah. And the funny thing about that concert was I knew all of her disco hits. She was great. And if her husband wasn't backstage with us, I would have asked her out to go back to Bunrattys to see a local band.
Another person I want to mention is Elvin Bishop. I've been friends with Elvin Bishop a long time. I met him because I was asked by Blues Blast magazine to do a cover story for him, and he appreciated that, and he was great. He's a big fisherman. He lives out in Oakland. To this day, he's a big gardener, and whenever I speak to him, I go, I hope the fish are biting for you, Elvin. But I'm still on his family's Christmas card list. How's that? Getting a Christmas card from Elvin Bishop, another guy that I'm friends with to this day is Mark Farner from Grand Funk Railroad. I met him. I was asked to go down to cover a story. It was a festival down in Cape Cod with Rick Derringer there, a lot of people that I knew. So I go down there, and Mark Farner, I met him on the first day right in the hotel lobby, and he comes up to me, and I introduce myself. Rick Derringer introduced me, and we are talking, and for the rest of that weekend, he made a point to say, hey, AJ, how you doing? I saw him 2 or 3 times a day, and he remembered my name. This is Mark Farner from Grand Funk Railroad remembering me. And, that humbled me a little bit, and that was I'm still very appreciative of that.
And Mick Taylor from the Rolling Stones, he was playing at the Hard Rock Cafe, and of course, I was assigned to write about it for one of the papers. I might have been the improper Bostonian that my story on Mick Taylor and my interview with him, the guy from the Rolling Stones, and I get him to for a local fanzine, and we were good friends for a couple of years. He used to love my chillum, and I once asked him. I remember I asked him. I said, "Did Mick and Keith write Silver Train, the song, for Johnny Winter, because it came out on Johnny Winter's album 6 months before it came out on the Rolling Stones album?" And he goes, "Not to my knowledge, mate." And I'll always remember that he kept calling me mate. Todd Rundgren's in town, and I was assigned to do a story for him, but he wasn't playing. He was playing in Worcester or something like that. And he was at like a clothing store or something that was on the fringe of rock and roll, but I wanted to meet him. So I went in there, and he was real tired. He tells me that he had just flown in 24-hour flight from Australia, and he was dead tired. So I go, "Don't ever fly on February 3rd." He goes, "Why not?" And I go, "Because Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Richie Valens died on that day." And he gave me a look, his eyes wide open, and he laughed. And for the rest of that night, for the hour that I'm still there, I would catch him looking over at me, and he'd just shake his head and smirk. But he didn't want to smoke any weed with me at that time because he was so tired. So I gave him a couple of joints. So if I ever see Todd Rundgren again, I know he'll remember who I am.
With the relationship you had with some local Boston bands, you were able to produce a few compilations. Can you speak about those?
Well, when I was writing for the Beat magazine, I'd go out to 2, 3, 4 nightclubs a night. And I often, very often, 1880, mid 80s, late 80s, I'd hear Beatles song being covered. And I'd always write about that in my gossip column in Significa. This band does the best version of She Loves You Since You Know Who. So finally, I had like 50 of them that I'd written. So I can still picture it. Mickey Olsen behind his desk, and I said, "Mick, this would make a great album." And he goes, "I agree." So then I started work. He started collecting the money, and I started collecting the bands. The first one in 1988 was Boston Does the Beatles on Fast Track Records, and we released that 20 years to the day after the Fab Four released their double white album. Let me tell you some of my favorites on Boston Does the Beatles. I love Barry Cowsill, who plays all the instruments, sings all the vocals on Everybody's Got Something to Hide, except for me and my monkey. I like AKA's She Said, AKA had Billy Clare, the great guitarist, on it. He's still playing. Who else did I like? I liked Power Glide, Revolution, 145's I'm Down. Dee Dee Stewart from Girls Night Out. You're going to lose that girl. You're going to lose that guy, which was great. Memphis Rockabilly did Honey Don't, and that was a problem because that was a cover of a cover. And I didn't know whether I should just put Beatles songs on or that. I also put Lizzie Borden and the Axis. They did Boys, which was great. But I didn't know whether to do it, so I made that A&R decision. And Mr. Kurt, he did a great version of a punk version of It's Only Love. And then Bim Scala Bim did a really great Rasta version of Rain. That was just killer. It was 31 local bands, Fast Track Records, 38 years ago, and we had the record release party at Bunrattys. And the second one was Botown Does Motown, 19 local bands from 1990 on Fast Track Records. I like Scott Gilman from New Man, I Can't Stand the Rain, and Peebles song. Condo Pygmies did a punk version of Get Ready. Taylor Made did Let's Stay Together. We also did Stax Vault too, and I had to add that too. Just great songs. Third one, which is my favorite, Boston Gets Stoned, 1992 on Botown Records. And we had Jimmy Miller, who produced Jethro Tull, Blind Faith, the Rolling Stones, from the Mick Taylor era, from Brian Jones. from Let It Bleed to Exile on Main Street. He was the producer. They even talk about him in a song. You can't always get what you want. He's Mr. Jimmy. He produced it, and I love Lucifer Miami, Lou Miami, the punk rocker doing Play with Fire, John Lincoln Wright, the legendary Bowtown, Bosstown Records, country and western guy doing, and the Sour Mash Boys doing Sitting on a Fence. Just killer. I liked Swinging Stakes doing Live With Me. It was just so cool that here I was with the guy who produced some of these songs originally, smoking weed in Normandy Recording Studios in Rhode Island, while he's shouting orders to his son Michael behind the board. He's going, "Lower the bass, Michael." And this is the only record that him and his son are on and jointly credited. His son's long dead too. So, for what it's worth, that was pretty cool. We were written up in Rolling Stone magazine, but I remember him and Mickey sitting there at lunch, and we saying we wanted him to do this, and he just looked at me and goes, I go, "How much are you going to charge me?" And he looked at me and he goes, "I don't know, is $500 too much?" And I laughed inside. I said immediately, even though Mickey was in charge of the money, he said, "Thank you. $500 from the guy who produced the Rolling Stones to produce me, who produced Motorhead, who produced Jethro Tull, Blind Faith, producing me." It was, a really, really good moment. A great memory, just me and him smoking weed, listening to Digger play Jumpin' Jack Flash, their version of Jumpin' Jack Flash at volume 11 in Normandy Sound. It was great. In 2009, 8 years after Mickey O'Halloran died, I finally found the master tape, and we released Boston Gets a Grip, all local bands doing Aerosmith songs. 19 local bands. You can still see the Bristol's version of Seasons of Wither on YouTube. I love James Montgomery doing Walk This Way. I love Living on the Edge by Paul Santo, Grammy Award winning producer, songwriter, artist. He won Grammys with Ringo Starr. He did a polka version of Living on the Edge.
Isn't there a story that you ran into Joe Perry once talking about the copyrights, or wasn't there something like that? You ran into one of them?
Years later, I went to a small music store and gave a copy of Boston Gets a Grip to Joe Perry. And he was there for, I think his book came out or something. It was just 5 years ago or so. And I said to him, "You know something? Here's a filing copy of Boston Gets a Grip after all these years. And thank you for not suing me for using your, for not, using your songs or whatever." I just said, that was implied. I said, "Thanks for not suing me." And he just smirked and he took the copy. I gave a copy to him and to Tom Hamilton. Those are the only two members of the group band that I was able to meet personally and give copies to.
Every 4th of July, Bloomberg Media puts on the legendary July 4th celebration on the Hat Show. A couple of years ago, they asked you to be part of the celebration. I was wondering how that came to be.
Harry Sandler, who runs the Music Museum of New England and was also the drummer in that famous Bosstown band Orpheus, he asked me, he said that he was contacted by Bloomberg Media, be interviewed, and he thought I'd be a perfect person too. So they had me over to the Paradise, and they asked me a few questions about the Boston music scene, and they put that on the video, the screens, the huge screens in front of the 500,000 people in attendance on the July 4th, Boston Symphony performance, and I was shown all over the world. And they did that again last year. So they are showing it from and maybe they'll do it again next year.
And what did they ask you about?
They just asked me about some of the great bands that I saw, some of the great people that have contributed to the scene.
We have a quote from Cliff Goodwin, who for years was the musical director of the Joe Cocker Band, as well as an original member of the John Butcher Axis. And he says, although I may not have any specific stories about AJ, I do remember and feel that he made me feel very special when we were doing an interview, and that's a rare attribute. Shall we say that the interviewer conveys the fact that he is listening to the person and not just going through the motions? That's a very valuable thing. Best of luck and take care.
Cliff is one of the greatest guitarists alive today. I listened to him. I saw him the first time I saw him play. I couldn't believe it. He played Run, Run, Rudolph by Chuck Berry, and I was sold. But this guy can play, and it's so appreciative to hear somebody notice something about the way I listen and the way I hear.
So for the past few years, you've been doing a podcast. Let's talk quickly about the concept of this podcast. And in particular, there's a couple of things that intrigue me. Is you have the legendary bass player, Harvey Brooks, who's on the early Bob Dylan albums and Electric Flag, and his resume is one of the most unbelievable. He donated your theme song.
Absolutely. I know Harvey for a long time through his very talented and lovely wife, Bonnie, who is an author of a child's book and just a ball of fire. One of my best friends, I speak to her a couple times a week on Facebook. All these years later, we've been doing that for 10, 15 years. Her and I got close, and then I became close with Harvey. She wrote a great children's book, Gramps Has a Ponytail, about Harvey. When I started the podcast, I put on Facebook a plea for anybody that had suggestions for music, a soundtrack, to please send it to me. And Harvey just had a new album out that he had sent me, Elegant Geezer, and he allowed me to use The Plum for an intro and Freeman for an outro. And we also got Dan McClellan from Scruffy the Cat, a great local band from the 80s. He did the artwork. He did a portrait of moi. And, another thing that Harvey did is his new book. He has a new book, Lessons, that just came out. And he actually thanks me in the credits. Another person that's really been very good to me and appreciative was Bobby Whitlock, who I was very good friends with for a long time. He was the keyboardist from Derek and the Dominoes, Eric Clapton's band, and they produced the great album Layla. Bobby came out with a book a couple of years back and used my quote on his own website for years, promoting it. I had said something like, his book about the music scene was like reading the Bible as written by Moses. That's what I wrote. And Bobby Whitlock just loved that quote.
I would too. One thing I want to ask in closing is there was an incident that happened at Bunrattys. And I was wondering if you could tell us the story of the unfortunate situation.
Abel Harris was shot and killed. He was a doorman, occasional floor guy, and occasional bartender. Real young kid, and he used to ride around in roller skates all over the place. He never walked. He was always on roller skates. Some guy came to the door. I'm not sure if it was him in the original, and he wasn't allowed in. He didn't have his ID, so he left, went home, got a gun, came back, opened the door, walked up, and shot. I was downstairs playing pool with a guy named Turkey, and Turkey was a big guy, rough guy, and when he heard the gunshot, he dropped on me, like protecting me. We went upstairs, and I saw Abel half in the doorway, half out with blood on the sidewalk under his head. And a guy, a friend of mine, regular, had his hand under Abel's head, kneeling over him, and he just looked up at me. And that's one thing I will never forget. His face, you know? And he died that night. The band that was playing that night was heavy metal band Bang. So people didn't know if that was part of the act.
The other producer of your podcast is, of course, your son, Harrison. So I want to bring Harrison into the conversation and see if he has any questions he wants to ask you.
Hi, David. Thank you and Dad for having me on today. Who inspired you the most in the Boston music scene?
Probably in the beginning, Mickey O'Halloran. You know, I went out with him to 2, 3, 4 nightclubs a night. He ran Bunrattys. He introduced me to his generation of important people. And, you know, he started me at the Beat magazine.
Yeah,
He made me famous.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dad. Thank you, David, for having me on the podcast. It's really, really fun time. It's good sharing memories with you. And thank you for all the hard work on the podcast, Dad. I mean, it's been a lot that we've done together, and you know, starting this during the pandemic was fun, and it's really lovely to see what it's blossomed, what it's becoming, you know.
One of the things that was big in the 80s were the WBCN Rock and Roll Rumbles. Did you ever attend one of those?
Yeah, I was a judge for a couple of years, and my favorite is probably 1986 when the finals was Gang Green versus Hearts on Fire, Johnny A's band, and Chris Doherty was in Gang Green. I'll never forget. I was standing right next to Albert when Chris Doherty spit into the audience. We just looked at each other. That was a great, great rumble. And Johnny A, Hearts on Fire, what a great band. And they still can't stand each other to this day. Gang Green, they played a great set. The audience loved them. Hearts on Fire, the audience loved them too. But like Johnny A said, they had just recently broken up and were asked by BCN to regroup for the Rumble, so they did. So Johnny A, you know, I mean, what do you got to say? 2 different styles of music. It was the beginning of the punk era. Well, not the beginning, but it was the punk era. Gang Green was on top of the world in Boston.
What's your favorite A.J. Wachtel story that you've heard?
One funny story is about Bono. Bono came into Bunrattys once. His band was playing the next night over in Worcester. So he comes in with 2 or 3 of his groupies. I get him a seat right in the front. I sit down and I talk to him about music. We're watching the band. I'm telling him about the Boston music scene. He didn't have a drink, but I got his roadies drinks. So he asked me, he goes, "You coming to see us play tomorrow night?" And I go, nah, this is my life. So 2 nights later, a local bartender, a good friend of mine, Roy DeLion, who I'm still in touch with, him and his wife Liz have kids and they live in Hawaii for eons. He comes in and he's talking about the show. And I go, "Oh, I know Bono." And he goes, "I know you do." And I laughed and I go, "How do you know?" He goes, "I was backstage." And he goes, I was just standing around, and Bono, I was drinking a beer, and Bono comes walking up to me. And he goes, "How you doing, mate?" He goes, "Where are you from?" So he introduces himself. He goes, "I'm from Boston." So Bono goes to Roy. He goes, "Boston." He goes, "You know Bunrattys?" And Roy worked in Bunrattys. He goes, "Of course I do." He goes, "You know AJ?" So Bono asked Roy if he knew me. And I'll bet if I went up to Bono in 2026 and I said, "You remember me, AJ from Bunrattys?" He'd give me a hug.
All right, well, let's do the final question of every Wachtelligence podcast, AJ. What was the first concert you attended?
I'll do even better than that. I'll give you my first 3 concerts I attended. The first was Woodstock. The second was at Drew University, I believe in Madison, New Jersey, up Route 24, Morris Avenue. I saw Gordon Lightfoot. That was in 1971. And then I saw, with a few of my older friends from high school, I went to see Johnny Winter and Elvin Bishop opening up the Allman Brothers live at the Fillmore East. I went to the early show instead of the late show so that, I snuck out. I couldn't get back at 3 in the morning when I was, 15 years old. So that was great. But my first concert was Woodstock. And that was a funny story because at Woodstock, I went to camp in Lake Como, Pennsylvania, which was about 10 miles from Hancock, New York, which was less than an hour away from White Lake in Woodstock. And I was going on a special camping trip with an older counselor, Bob Carson. And he was a balding guy with glasses, and he was a real camping nut. And we went on we got on the highway, and this was, remember, this was 60 years ago. It wasn't as car friendly today as it was more car friendly today than it was back then. All you had was exits and roads and occasional restaurant, gas station, or hotel. So we get on, and all there was traffic. And so we, instead of going to Buttermilk Falls, which was where we were going, we had tents, we had everything. We were going to camp out. About 6 of us, I think, and Bob Carson, the older counselor, and another counselor of ours, and we ended up going to Woodstock. And where we sat, where we ended up, was if you're facing the stage, we were all the way to the far left, and you can see, we were in front of trees, and behind the trees was a pond. And I'll tell you, I was 13 years old. It was raining out. People were skinny dipping, and that was the first time I ever saw a woman's breast in my life. And that's what I remember about Woodstock, all right?
Do you think Woodstock changed your life or affected your life?
I don't know. Maybe it was all predestined. Maybe maybe I was just fulfilling what's already planned out, because I really had no choice in the matter. I was going to go out camping, and we brought tents. It was pouring rain. I don't remember all the shows and everything. I was 13 years old, but I remember, and I did smoke weed there. Okay, let that be told. And we didn't have any weed, but everybody was around smoking, and I took it. I didn't know what the hell it was.
But it really was a sense of family. I guess that's where I was going. Not necessarily. We obviously know about the drug culture.
I wasn't that friendly with any of the kids I went with. To camp.
No, but
on
in
the
the
trip
sense that you could walk up to anybody, and everybody was approaching.
Yeah, it was wild. I was 13 years old. It was loud music. First thing in the morning, all night. It was just wild. It really opened my eyes up to, hey, life is bigger than Springfield, New Jersey, and it really set me on my road. I started writing about music. I didn't write stories. I wasn't a newscaster. I started writing about music. So in that sense, yeah, I guess it, maybe it was predestined, because I certainly didn't have a choice in it, but look at where I am today.
AJ, it's been my honor to do this. I could listen to these stories all day. Thank you so much for letting me do this with you.
Thanks for being my producer, an old friend. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Wachtelligence. You can connect with me on Facebook at Wachtelligence. Thanks to my producers, my son Harrison and David Schwartz and Harvey Brooks for my theme song. Don't forget to subscribe.
I don't care what you think of me. Don't need no jailer to set me free. Don't want strangers filling up my cup. Don't need no advisor to show me down from up.